The moment Pauline Norris saw the rider coming up the switchback trail toward her homestead, she already had her Winchester leveled at the tree line, her finger resting easy against the guard, her jaw set like carved granite against the Colorado mountain wind. She had been waiting for trouble ever since the letter arrived 3 weeks ago. Some terse, businesslike notice from a land broker in Denver informing her that the property she had lived on, worked, buried her father on, and bled over for the past 4 years had been sold to a Warren Hadley of St. Louis, Missouri, effective immediately, and that she should make arrangements to vacate at her earliest convenience. She had read the letter twice. Then she had folded it precisely, placed it in the tin box where she kept every deed, survey record, water rights filing, and tax receipt her father had ever accumulated, and she had gone out onto the porch with her rifle and waited. That had been 22 days ago, and the mountain had kept its silence. Until now. The rider came into the clearing on a dark bay horse that moved with more grace than its rider deserved. The man in the saddle sat straight enough. She would give him that, but he wore a coat that cost more than her milk cow and boots that had never once seen genuine mud. His hat was a fine brown Stetson that still held its original shape, the crease too perfect, the brim too clean. Everything about him said money and Eastern ideas, and the combination of those two things in the Colorado high country of 1882 had never once produced anything good in Pauline Norris's experience. She stepped off the porch and planted herself in the middle of the packed dirt yard, rifle held across her body, not aimed but visible and entirely deliberate. The rider pulled up his horse about 30 feet out, close enough to see her clearly and far enough to make sensible decisions. He was younger than she had expected. She had constructed in her mind a bloated, middle-aged investor, the kind who bought land over telegraph wires from the comfort of a carpeted office while smoking expensive tobacco. Instead, the man who sat looking down at her was somewhere in his early 30s, lean but not slight, with dark hair that the wind had already disordered despite the quality hat, and eyes that were, even at this distance, unsettlingly direct. He looked at her rifle. He looked at her face. He did not raise his hands like a guilty man, and he did not reach for anything that might make her nervous. He just sat there on his horse and studied the situation with an expression that was neither afraid nor foolishly confident. "I am going to guess," he said at last, his voice carrying clearly across the yard and carrying, she noted with irritation, no particular alarm, "that you are not the welcoming committee." "You would guess correctly," Pauline said. "State your business and then state your name and do them in that order." "My name is Warren Hadley," he said, "and my business is that I own this property." "No," she said, "you do not." He reached slowly into his coat pocket, producing a folded document, and held it out toward her. "I have a deed that says otherwise." "I have a deed that says otherwise to your deed," she said. "And I have been standing on this land since 1878, which means I have 4 years of residency and improvement to say otherwise even beyond that. Whatever paper you are holding was sold to you illegally by a broker who had no right to sell it." A long pause. The wind moved through the lodgepole pines along the ridge and made its cold, constant commentary on the affairs of human beings. Warren Hadley looked at the document in his hand, then at her, then at the cabin behind her with its solid chinked logs and its kitchen garden still showing the last of the autumn squash, and the well-maintained woodpile stacked 6 feet high against the west wall. "You live here," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not a question so much as a man adjusting his understanding of a situation. "I have lived here since my father brought us up from Pueblo in the spring of 1878, she said. "I have lived here alone since he died in the winter of 1880. I have paid taxes on this land to Jefferson County every single year, and I have the receipts to prove it. Whoever sold you this property, Mr. Hadley, sold you something that was not theirs to sell." He folded his document and put it back in his pocket without any visible anger, which surprised her. Most men, presented with the failure of something they had paid good money for, got loud about it before they got logical. This one seemed to be doing the arithmetic quietly. "Would you be willing," he said carefully, "to let me step down from this horse and take a look at what you have in that tin box or wherever it is you keep your paperwork? I am not asking you to lower that rifle. I am just asking for a conversation." Pauline considered him for a moment. She was 26 years old, and she had been managing this mountain on her own for 2 years. She knew how to read men the way she knew how to read whether coming over the Continental Divide, not perfectly, not always, but well enough to stay alive. This one did not feel like a man who had come to bully her off her land. He felt like a man who had just discovered he might have been robbed and was trying to figure out exactly how. "You can step down," she said. "You stay in the yard. You do not enter the house. And you are going to want to move slowly because I am an excellent shot, and this is my home, and I am not bluffing." "I did not think for a single second that you were," he said, and there was something in his voice then that was almost warm with appreciation. He stepped down from the horse with reasonable ease, tied it to the post by the water trough, and stood in the yard with his hands visible and his posture carefully, deliberately unthreatening. She went inside briefly, keeping the door cracked so she could see him through it, and retrieved the tin box. She brought it out to the porch table, set it down, and opened it with the rifle still resting across her left arm. "Come onto the porch," she said, slowly. He came onto the porch slowly. She laid out her documents one by one in the way her father had taught her: survey first, then deed of original purchase from the Territorial Land Office, then the continuous tax receipts for 1878, 1879, 1880, 1881, and the one she had just paid for the current year, then the water rights filing along the creek that ran through the eastern pasture. She laid them out in a neat row and stepped back so he could read them without getting close to her. Warren Hadley leaned over the table and read. He read carefully and thoroughly, the way a man reads when the reading matters, not scanning but absorbing, and when he was done he straightened up and blew out a long breath through his nose. "The broker's name was Elias Cormack," he said. "I do not know that name," she said. "He operates out of Denver," Warren said, "and he represented himself to me as the legal agent for a Terrence Norris who wanted to liquidate his Colorado mountain holdings." Something cold moved through Pauline's chest that was not the wind. "Terrence Norris was my father," she said quietly. "He died in February of 1880. He left this land to me. It is in his will, which is on file with the county clerk in Golden City, and a copy of that will is in this box." She pulled the copy of the will from the tin and held it out. He took it gently, read it, and the line of his mouth went hard in a way that was not directed at her. "Cormack knew your father was dead," Warren said. "He must have. He told me the seller was traveling in the eastern states and was handling the transaction by proxy. He had documents. They appeared legitimate. He set the will down with more care than she expected. He forged your father's signature, or he had someone do it." "That would make him a criminal," Pauline said. "Yes," Warren said. "It would." He looked at her steadily. "And it would make me an unwitting fool who paid $1,500 for land he cannot legally claim." The number was larger than she had expected him to say out loud, and some of the rigidity in her posture shifted fractionally. Not because of the money itself, but because of the tone in which he said it, not the tone of a man demanding compensation, but the tone of a man who was genuinely, quietly furious at having been deceived, and was doing his level best to think clearly about it instead of taking his anger out sideways. $1,500, she said. "Yes," he said. "That is a significant sum," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Which means I have a significant problem with Elias Cormack and none with you, Miss Norris." She watched him for a beat. Outside, his bay horse moved against the trough, making a soft, satisfied sound in the late afternoon light. The sun was going orange over the peaks to the west, the kind of light that made the spruce trees look like they were on fire from the inside, and it caught the side of Warren Hadley's face and showed her a jaw that was tired, and eyes that were frustrated but honestly so, and a man who had ridden, by the look of his horse and himself, a considerable distance today, and had arrived to find not the uninhabited investment property he had purchased, but a woman with a Winchester and 4 years of righteous claim. "You came all this way," she said. "From Denver this morning," he said. "I came from St. Louis last week." "What were you planning to do with it?" she asked. "With this property, what did you think you were buying?" He looked out at the mountain, at the meadow below the cabin and the dark timber above it, at the creek line catching gold light through the aspens along its banks. He took a breath, and it was a breath of someone taking in something they had not known they wanted until they saw it. "I had an idea," he said, and he said it quietly, almost to himself, "about starting over." Pauline Norris had not expected that answer, and because she had not expected it, she did not have a prepared response for it. She let the silence sit for a moment, and the mountain filled it in with wind and the distant sound of the creek. "You had better sit down," she said finally, "while I decide what we are going to do about Elias Cormack." Something moved across his face, then relief, she thought, but it was brief and controlled, and he sat down in the chair she indicated on the far end of the porch and did not push his luck. Her name was Pauline Constance Norris, and she had never in her life been a woman who required the assistance of others to handle her own affairs. That was not pride talking. That was simply the arithmetic of how her life had been arranged. Her mother had died when Pauline was 9, of a fever that swept through Pueblo in the late summer heat, and after that it had been Pauline and her father, Thomas Norris, who had been a quiet and capable man with a gift for reading land the way other men read books. He had looked at a survey map of the Jefferson County high country and seen something worth climbing to, and in the spring of 1878 he had packed everything they owned onto 2 mules and a wagon and started up toward the mountains. He had been right about the land. It was good land, not farmland. The elevation was too high and the season too short for real crops, but grazing land and timber that could be selectively cut, and a creek that ran clean and cold year-round, and a view from the front porch on a clear day that went all the way south to where Pikes Peak stood above the plains. Her father had built the cabin solid and permanent, and had run a small cattle operation with a modest herd, and Pauline had learned every single aspect of it alongside him. When he died, a lung fever in the bitter winter of 1880, going quick the way those things sometimes mercifully did, she had been 24 years old, and she had sat with his body through the night and buried him the next morning on the south slope where the sun hit longest, and then she had gotten up and kept going. She had reduced the herd to what she could manage alone. She had taken on a hired hand for branding season and let him go when the work was done. She had repaired the fence lines and maintained the cabin and paid her taxes and kept her paperwork in order because Thomas Norris had raised her to understand that in the business of land, paperwork was armor. She had not been prepared for someone to forge her dead father's name and sell his land out from under her. That was the particular failure she was going to have to sit with, the gap in her armor that she had not known to cover. Now she was sitting across a porch table from the man who had inadvertently bought her home, and he was reading her water rights document with close attention while the evening darkened around them, and she was trying to figure out what came next. "The county clerk in Golden City," he said, "would have the original deed and the will on file." "Yes," she said. "If you took those filings to a territorial judge, Cormack's transaction would be voided," he said. "Your claim would be affirmed. You would keep the property." "Yes," she said again, "but I would need to get to Golden City, which is 2 days down the mountain and 2 days back, and I cannot leave the cattle unattended for 4 days, and the nearest court that would hear a land dispute of this nature is likely in Denver, which is further still." She paused. "None of which is your problem." "It is partially my problem," he said, "because I would need to testify about what Cormack told me and present the documents he sold me as evidence of fraud. Your claim would be cleaner with my corroboration than without it." He looked up from the water rights filing. "If you are willing to travel to Denver, I would go with you. I have business there anyway, and frankly I would like very much to see Elias Cormack answer for what he did." She studied him in the evening light. He had taken his hat off at some point and set it on the table, and without it he looked younger and also more honest, if that was a thing a hat could conceal or reveal. His hair was dark and slightly too long, curling a little at the ears where the hat had held it, and he had the look of a man who had once been entirely comfortable in the comfortable world of Eastern money, and had recently developed some doubts about whether comfort was what he actually wanted. "Why did you come out here?" she asked, and she meant it differently than when she had asked before. Not what did you plan to do with the land? Why you specifically? Why sent Louis to Colorado? Why sight unseen? He was quiet for a moment, and she had the feeling she was the first person who had asked him that directly, or at least the first person he was considering answering honestly. "I had a business in St. Louis," he said. "A trading company. It was my father's originally, and his father's before that. I ran it for 6 years, and I was good at it. And one morning about 8 months ago I woke up and could not make myself go to the office. Not because I was ill. Because I sat there in my bed and tried to think of a single good reason, and I could not come up with one." He turned the water rights document over in his fingers without looking at it. "I sold the business to my partner. I settled my affairs. I bought a train ticket to Denver because I had read about this territory, and I thought there was something out here worth coming for. Land of my own. Something real to put my hands on." He set the document down. "And then I bought a property I had never seen from a broker. I did not investigate closely enough, and here I am." "Here you are," she agreed. "I realize that from where you are standing. I am simply the latest in a long line of Eastern men who have caused problems for people who were already here and managing perfectly well," he said, and the directness of it surprised her. "You are aware of that pattern," she said. "I am aware of a great many patterns that my side of the equation has not historically been very honest about," he said. "It does not excuse the stupidity of what I did, but I want you to know I did not intend to harm you. I intended to find something worth working for." He looked at her with that disconcerting directness. "I did not know you were here." "I know you did not," she said, and she did know that. She had known it since approximately 10 minutes after he had stepped off his horse, which was the problem, because it would have been considerably easier if he had turned out to be the blunt, arrogant investor she had imagined. "I will sleep outside tonight," he said. "I have a bedroll. If you are willing to discuss the Denver matter in the morning, I will be here. If you want me off the property at first light, I will go, and I will still testify on your behalf whenever the court date is set, because that is the right thing to do." She looked at him for a long time. The stars were coming out over the peaks, the way they did up here, sudden and absolute, and the temperature was dropping fast the way it did in the Colorado high country in October, heading toward genuine cold before midnight. "There is a barn," she said finally, "which is warmer than sleeping outside. You may have the barn." His mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "Thank you, Miss Norris." "Do not make me regret it," she said. "I will do my best," he said. She gave him a lantern, and he took his horse to the barn, and she went inside and bolted the door and lay in her bed for a long time in the dark, listening to the mountain sounds that she knew as well as her own name, and thinking about a man who had come all this way looking for something real to put his hands on. The morning came in cold and clear, the aspens along the creek burning their last gold before the week's cold stripped them. And when Pauline came out of the cabin at first light with her rifle out of habit more than genuine expectation, she found Warren Hadley already awake, already dressed, already crouched at the fire ring by the east side of the cabin, building a fire with the particular, patient competence of someone who had been at it long enough to stop fighting the wood and start working with it. She stopped on the porch step and watched him. He had found the wood pile without being told where it was, had taken from the top of the stack rather than pulling out pieces from the middle the way ignorant people did and ruined the whole arrangement, and he was laying the tinder in the proper cone shape before adding the larger splits. He did not look up when she came out, but there was a quality to his stillness that said he knew she was there. "Coffee," he said, "requires a pot, which I do not have, and water from the creek, which I was going to get after the fire was going. But if you have both of those things and are willing to share them, I would very much like to be useful this morning." "There is a pot on the stove inside," she said, "and a bucket on the porch." He retrieved the bucket from the porch and went down the path to the creek and came back with water and built the fire up to the right temperature and made the coffee with the efficiency of a man who had been camping long enough to know what he was doing, which was another thing she had not expected from the fine coat and the clean boots. The boots were somewhat less clean this morning. The mountain had been working on them since yesterday. She sat on the porch step with her rifle across her knees because the habit was the habit, and he sat on the upturned crate he had pulled from beside the door and handed her a tin cup of coffee and held his own, and the two of them looked out at the mountain in the early light. "The cattle need moving to the lower pasture before the next snow," she said. It was not an invitation. It was simply the fact she was most immediately occupied with. "How many head?" he asked. 18, she said. "I can help with that," he said. "Before we talk about Denver," she looked at him sideways. "You know cattle. My grandfather had a farm in Ohio," he said. "I spent summers there as a boy. I will not pretend to be a cowboy, and I will not get in your way, but I can follow directions and I know which end of a cow kicks." Against her better judgment, Pauline Norris almost smiled. She did not smile, but she almost did, and the fact of it surprised her enough that she looked away toward the ridgeline and held on to the serious expression that the situation warranted. They moved the cattle that morning, working the high pasture fence line and pushing the herd down through the timber gate to the lower meadow, where there was still good grass and better protection from the northwest wind. Warren Hadley was not, as he had honestly stated, a cowboy, but he had a decent seat on his horse, and he was quiet and steady in his movements, and the cattle did not spook from him, which was the main thing. He had shed the expensive coat in favor of the plainer canvas jacket she saw rolled behind his saddle, and in it he looked more like a man who belonged to a mountain than he had yesterday. He made a mistake with the gate latch, the way newcomers did, and she corrected him without ceremony, and he took the correction without any injured pride about it, which was another point in his favor whether she wanted to be tallying points or not. They got the cattle down by mid-morning, and she showed him how to check the fence line for the sections the elk had been testing, because elk did not care about cattle fencing, and the two animals' territories in this particular valley had a long and unresolved negotiation ongoing. He walked the line with her and asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than politely performative, and she answered them and found herself talking more freely than she usually did, which was a function of the isolation, she told herself. A person living alone on a mountain did not have many people to talk to, and it was natural that when one appeared the words came more easily. "Tell me about your father," he said, not out of nowhere. They were standing at the corner post where she always felt her father's presence most strongly, because this was the post he had set himself, tamped down by hand, level and sure, and the question did not feel presumptuous. It felt like someone who had picked up on something real. "He was the best man I ever knew," she said, and left a space in the sentence where more words might or might not follow. "He saw things other people missed. Not just land, people. He could walk into a room and know within 5 minutes which person in it was honest and which was not." "You have that," Warren said. She looked at him. "That ability," he said. "You had my measure inside of 10 minutes yesterday. I saw it happen. I had you placed in a category," she said, "and I was revising by the end." "Which category?" he asked. "Entitled Eastern Investor," she said without inflection. He received this without flinching. "Fair," he said. "Less accurate than it was 10 minutes before, more accurate than it is now." "Yes," she said, and this time the almost smile went a little further before she pulled it back. They walked back to the cabin, and she made a midday meal of beans and salt pork and cornbread, which was not a fancy meal but was hot and good. And he ate it with honest appreciation and cleaned his own plate without being asked, and they sat at the table inside for the first time, with the documents spread between them, and talked about Denver. "If we go to the territorial court," she said, "we need Cormac's original transaction documents, your copies, my deed and will copy, the tax receipts and witnesses. You can testify to what he told you about my father. Do you have anyone else who witnessed your transaction with him?" "My business partner was with me when I signed," Warren said. "He is still in Denver, he could testify." "What is his name?" she asked. "Robert Finch," Warren said. "He is a good man and a reliable witness. He thought the price was too low at the time, which I should have listened to." "Low prices on good property are never accidental," she said. Her father had told her that. "No," Warren agreed. "They are not." "I will need 3 days to arrange the cattle for my absence," she said. "There is a neighbor family, the Abelards, who run a spread about 4 miles down the valley. Henry Abelard has helped me before. He can keep an eye on the herd while I am gone." "Tell me what you need done before we leave," Warren said, "and I will help." She looked at him across the documents and the half-eaten cornbread, and the afternoon light coming through the cabin's one west window, and warming the interior in that particular way it had at this time of year. And she thought about what it would mean to trust him enough to turn her back on him for the duration of a 3-day trail ride to Denver. And then she thought about the fact that he had not, in any moment since his arrival, done anything to earn her distrust. He had been honest. He had been useful. He had been careful with her property and respectful of her authority over it, and he had not once suggested by word or posture or expression that the rifle she kept close was anything other than reasonable. 3 days, she said. Be ready at first light on Friday. He was ready at first light on Friday. He had used the 3 days to make himself genuinely useful, helping her repair the section of fence she had been putting off, because it required 2 people to hold the wire taut while driving the staples, helping her split the last of the firewood that needed doing before winter. And on Thursday evening she had come out of the barn to find him on the roof of the hay shed, replacing 3 shingles that had been loose since last summer's hailstorm. She had stood below looking up at him with a complicated set of feelings that she was not yet prepared to name. "You did not have to do that," she said. "The shingles were going to let water in," he said, "and you have good hay under there." He climbed down with the easy efficiency of a man who had recently decided that being useful was going to be his primary occupation. "Also, I needed something to do with my hands." That night, she made supper for both of them and they sat at the table again, and he told her more about St. Louis and the trading company, and the specific morning he had woken up, and understood that the life he had been living was a very good performance of a life, but not the actual thing. She told him about the years she had managed the property alone, and about the particular quality of winter silence up here that she had at first found crushing and had gradually come to understand as a kind of gift. The silence that told you exactly who you were when no one else was around. "And who are you?" he asked, not as a challenge but as a genuine question from a man who was watching her carefully and wanted to understand. "Someone who knows what she wants and what she has earned," she said. "Someone who does not need anyone to hand her anything, but who is not too proud to recognize when help is honestly given." He was quiet for a moment after that. "That is about as fine a description of a person as I have heard in some time," he said, and there was no flattery in it, just a plain recognition that she received with more difficulty than she would have liked. The ride to Denver took the better part of 3 days because the autumn weather was holding and the trail was manageable. But the high pass on the second day was already dusted with early snow, and they moved through it in a silence that was not uncomfortable, the 2 horses finding their footing on the switchbacks while the wind came down off the peaks and made conversation impractical. They camped 2 nights on the trail, and the first night Pauline set up her bedroll on one side of the fire and he set up on the other without comment. And the second night the temperature dropped enough that moving the bedrolls closer to the fire, and therefore to each other, was purely a practical matter, and they both knew it and neither of them made it into something it was not. But in the morning of that second day, When she woke before him and lay for a few minutes watching the sky go from black to charcoal, the particular blue that meant 4 in the morning at altitude, she was aware of his breathing on the other side of the fire, steady and deep, and not her own. And something about the sound of it moved through her in a way that was new and unwelcome and probably, she thought with the clarity that very cold pre-dawn air produced, entirely inevitable. They reached Denver in the afternoon of the third day, coming into it from the west on the road that was already busy with freight wagons and livestock, and the general commerce of what had become, in just the few years since Pauline had last seen it, a genuinely sizable city. She had been here twice before, both times with her father, and the growth of it struck her freshly every time. The brick buildings going up, the telegraph lines, the railroad depot with its constant noise and motion, the sense of a place that was still in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. Warren had been here recently enough to know his way, and he took them to a boarding house on Larimer Street, run by a woman named Mrs. Dowd, who had an honest face and separate rooms, and charged fair rates. He paid for both rooms before Pauline could object, and when she did object he said, "Consider it partial compensation for the inconvenience of having your property fraudulently sold," which was either very practical or very clever, and probably both, and she let it stand because he was not wrong. Robert Finch met them that evening at the hotel dining room, a compact, neat man in his 40s with a lawyer's precision of manner and a genuine warmth when he shook Warren's hand. He listened to Pauline's account of the fraud with the focused attention of someone who was simultaneously taking notes in his head, and by the time she finished he was already thinking about the case. "I remember having a poor feeling about Cormac from the first meeting," he told Warren. "Something in the way he handled the documents was too smooth, too rehearsed." "You told me at the time that the price concerned you," Warren said. "I told you twice," Finch said without rancor. "Miss Norris, your documents are solid. A proper accounting of the fraudulent deed versus your original deed and continuous tax record should be straightforward. I can help you find the right judge." "I would appreciate that," she said. "The only question," Finch said carefully, "is whether Cormac is still in Denver and accessible. Men in his line of work sometimes become difficult to locate once the wrong people start asking for them." He was found on the second day, because Finch knew which offices he worked from, and the territorial marshal was not unacquainted with Elias Cormac's reputation. The man was brought in for questioning, and his records were examined, and among his papers, as Pauline had suspected, were not only the forged documents pertaining to her property, but evidence of at least 4 other similar frauds committed against landowners whose records were in any way accessible, and whose ability to defend themselves was in any way limited. Her father's name, forged in a shaking imitation of his actual signature, was there in black ink on the fraudulent deed, and looking at it in the marshal's office, Pauline felt something cold and clean move through her that was not grief exactly, but was the far edge of it, the anger that grief sometimes grew into when it had been sitting long enough. "That is not my father's signature," she said quietly to the marshal. "I have correspondence in my possession, letters he wrote me and receipts he signed, that would demonstrate the difference clearly." "We will want those as exhibits," said the marshal's deputy. "Can you make them available?" "I can have them here within the week," she said. The court hearing was set for 8 days hence, and during those 8 days Pauline Norris stayed in Denver and did something she had never once done in her adult life. She waited. She was not good at it. She was a woman built for action and for work, and for the specific kind of discipline that meant always having the next thing to do, and sitting in a Denver boarding house with a legal process grinding forward, without anything she could do to accelerate it was, in her own private assessment, the most difficult thing she had endured since the 2 days her father lay dying, and there was nothing she could do for him but be there. Warren Hadley, who was also waiting, seemed to understand this about her without her saying it, and he spent those 8 days finding things for them to do together that were not just sitting. He took her to the land office to verify that the county clerk's records matched her copies, which they did. He took her to a lawyer he knew of named Hartley who reviewed her claim and said it was airtight. He bought a city map from a newspaper stand and spread it on the table at the boarding house dining room and showed her where the court was located and how the proceeding would go. And she showed him, on the same map, where the mountain would be if the map extended far enough west to show it. And he leaned over the map beside her and looked at the blank space where the mountains began. And there was such a visible longing in his face that she said, without having planned to say it, "You really did want to go out there and start something new?" "Yes," he said simply. "What kind of something?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I had thought about horses," he said. "There is good grazing on that lower meadow. The elevation is too high for grain crops but not for hay if you irrigate from the creek. A small horse operation, breeding, maybe some training. I know horses." He paused. "I know I have no claim to any of that now. I'm just telling you what I had imagined." Pauline looked at the map for a long time. She thought about the lower meadow, which was better grazing than she currently used it for because 18 cattle did not need all of it. She thought about the creek and the irrigation ditch her father had started and she had never finished. She thought about the fence lines and how they would need to be extended for horses and how that was a two-person job. She said nothing, but she kept thinking about it. On the fourth day of waiting, they walked along the Platte River where it ran through the south part of the city, because walking was easier than sitting, and the river offered a kind of moving quiet that Pauline recognized as close to the creek sound she was missing. The aspens along the bank were bare now, October having done its work while she was away from the mountain, and the light came through the bare branches at a low angle and laid long shadows across the path. "I owe you an apology," Warren said, not looking at her but at the river. "You have been apologizing since you arrived," she said. "Not for this," he said. He stopped walking and she stopped beside him and he looked at her with that directness she had gradually stopped being startled by. "I looked at you the first morning when you were making the fire, and I thought you were the most capable and the most genuine person I had encountered in a very long time. And I have been using this situation, the cattle, the fence, the firewood as an excuse to stay close to you, and that is not entirely honorable when you did not ask for my company." She looked at him for a moment. The river moved beside them and a wagon crossed the bridge upstream and a woman called to a child somewhere behind the tree line on the bank. "I noticed," she said, "that you were doing those things." "And," he said. "And I let you," she said. He was quiet. "I am not in the habit," she said carefully, "of letting people stay close. I find it uncomfortable. I find it uncomfortable because it requires trusting someone else's continued presence, and in my experience people's continued presence is not something you can count on." She paused. "My mother, my father, everyone I have known well has left, one way or another." "I understand that," he said. "I know you do," she said, because she had been listening to him for 8 days and she did understand that he understood, which was the thing about him that was most difficult to maintain a sensible distance from. "Then I will tell you directly," he said, "which you seem to prefer." "I do prefer it." "I would like to stay," he said. "Not on your land, not in your house. I am not asking for anything that is yours. But I would like to find a way to stay in this part of the world, and I would like to know you better, and I would like, in time, if you are willing, to give you a reason to count on my continued presence." The aspens cast their bare-branched shadows on the path between them. The river made its perpetual sound. Warren Hadley stood there and waited, which she was coming to understand was what he did when something mattered to him. He went very still and he waited, the way a man does when he knows that pushing will ruin everything. "That is," she said slowly, "about as honest a thing as anyone has ever said to me. I have found," he said, "that honesty is somewhat more efficient in the long run." This time she did smile, and she felt it happen and did not pull it back, and she saw his face change when it did, a warmth coming into it that was not performed, but was as real and unguarded as anything she had seen in a human face in a long time. "Come back to the mountain," she said. "After the court hearing, we can see what the winter says." "I will take that," he said, and she could hear in the 3 words that he meant it entirely. The court hearing was held 8 days after their arrival in Denver, in a wood-paneled room in the Jefferson County Courthouse with a territorial judge named Ira Weston presiding, who had the weathered face of a man who had seen every variety of frontier transaction and was not easily impressed or deceived. He reviewed Pauline's documents methodically. He heard Warren's testimony about the transaction with Cormac, corroborated by Robert Finch. He examined the forged deed against the correspondence Pauline had provided with her father's genuine signature, and the difference was apparent even without expert testimony. The genuine signature having the particular confident slant of a man who had been writing his own name for 60 years, and the forgery having the careful, slightly labored quality of someone trying to reproduce what they did not fully understand. Elias Cormac was present, represented by an attorney who offered a defense that Judge Weston heard with a patience that thinned visibly as it progressed. When it was done, Weston looked at Cormac over his reading glasses for a moment with the expression of a man who has already formed his conclusion and is simply allowing the formality of the moment to complete itself. The ruling took less than an hour of deliberation. Pauline Norris's claim to the property was affirmed. The fraudulent deed was voided. Elias Cormac was referred to the territorial marshal for criminal prosecution on fraud charges, and the evidence of the other similar cases his records had revealed meant he was going to be answering questions for a considerable time. The matter of Warren Hadley's $1,500 was a civil question that Judge Weston noted would need to be pursued against Cormac separately, and Finch indicated quietly that he was already preparing to do exactly that. Pauline walked out of the courthouse into the October Denver air with her tin box under her arm and her property affirmed and her father's name cleared, and she stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed. Warren came out behind her and stood beside her and did not say anything, which was exactly right. "Thank you," she said. "You did this yourself," he said. "I provided corroboration and transportation. You brought the truth." "The transportation was not nothing," she said. She looked sideways at him. "I mean it, Warren." It was the first time she had used his first name, and they both registered it in the small silence that followed. "You are welcome, Pauline," he said. They left Denver the next morning. Finch saw them off from the boarding house with a handshake for Warren and a surprisingly genuine bow of the head for Pauline, and she liked him for not being surprised by the 2 of them riding out together, which meant he had seen something in Warren that she was still in the process of verifying for herself. The ride back was longer feeling than the ride down had been, because they were going uphill and the horses knew it, and the cold was more serious now, the first real bite of the Colorado November beginning to sharpen the air at altitude. They camped in the same spots as the journey down, the same fire circles, the same division of labor that they had developed without discussing it, him with the fire and the horses, her with the camp food and the perimeter check that was habit from years of being alone in the mountains. On the second night, sitting by the fire with coffee in hand and the stars overhead doing their absolute indifferent best, Warren said, "Tell me what you want. Not what you need, not what the land requires, what you actually want." She thought about it honestly, which she could do because he asked honestly. "I want to keep what my father built," she said. "I want to see it become what it could be. The upper pasture could carry twice the cattle if the water was better managed. The lower meadow, I have been thinking about what you said about horses. I have not had the capital to develop it, and I have not had the second pair of hands to expand. And besides the land," he said. She looked into the fire. "I want not to be alone anymore," she said. "I have been proud of managing it, and I am not going to stop being proud of it. But pride is cold company on a winter night at 7,000 feet. He was quiet for a moment. "I have enough capital left from the sale of my business to make a serious investment in that property," he said. In horses, in fencing, in whatever the land needs to be what it could be. I would do that as a partner, not as an owner. Your name on the deed, my investment applied. We work it together." "That is not a common arrangement," she said. "No," he said, "it is not." "People would have opinions about it," she said. "People have opinions about everything," he said. "I do not find that particularly limiting." She looked at him across the fire. He was, she thought, the most undefended man she had ever met, not naive, not blind to the world's difficulties, but genuinely without the defensive layers that most people accumulated like scar tissue over years of disappointment. He had taken the loss of $1,500 and a plan that fell apart, and a woman pointing a rifle at him, and turned all of it into a reason to be present and honest and useful. And she found that she could not quite identify how she had expected to get through the rest of her life without encountering a person like this. "There is a lot I would need to know about you before I accepted that arrangement," she said. "Ask me," he said. "I will answer anything you want to know." She asked him. Over the next hour, by firelight, with the mountain night doing its best to argue otherwise, she asked him the things that mattered about his character, about his failures, about what he had done wrong in his life, and what he thought about those things now. She asked about his family in St. Louis, and he told her about a father who had been a good businessman and a mediocre parent, and a mother who had done her best with limited emotional materials available. She asked about women, because that was a thing that had to be asked, and he told her quietly that there had been a woman in St. Louis named Catherine, whom he had been engaged to for 2 years before it ended because she had wanted the life he was busy selling, and he had not known how to explain that he did not want it either, and the ending had been honest and had left them on terms that were respectful if not warm. She told him about the man from Pueblo who had courted her before they left, the rancher's son who had been handsome and not unpleasant, but who had eventually made clear that the version of her he wanted was the one who stayed home and did not go trailing off into the mountains with her father, and she had chosen the mountains without significant grief. "You have always known what you wanted," he said. "My father raised me to know my own mind," she said. "He said the saddest thing a person could do was spend their life wondering what they actually wanted, because no one had ever encouraged them to find out." "He sounds like he was remarkable," Warren said. "He was," she said, and this time the grief in it was not sharp but was deep and settled, the kind that means someone has been genuinely mourned. They got back to the mountain on the 3rd afternoon, coming up through the last switchback as the sun was going west and orange over the peaks, and the cabin came into view in its small clearing, and the woodpile was exactly as she had left it, and the smoke was coming from the Abelard's direction down the valley, which meant Henry was around and keeping an eye on things. The cattle were visible in the lower meadow, heads down in the good afternoon grass, calm and accounted for. Pauline Norris stood in her stirrups for a moment and looked at all of it, and felt the particular, specific relief of return that you only felt when a place was truly yours. "It is beautiful," Warren said beside her, and she believed him. He spent the winter there, which was not how she had imagined it and entirely how it had to be. It made practical sense. The mountain in winter was genuinely dangerous for a man alone in a camp, and there was the barn, and there was work enough for two, and the cold months went fast when there were two people sharing the labor of survival. He was in the barn, and she was in the cabin, and there were proper boundaries that the mountain cold enforced without discussion. But there were also long evenings by the stove and the gradual accumulation of familiarity that comes only from working alongside someone through the dark months. He learned things from her: how to read the weather coming off the continental divide, how to manage the cattle in deep snow, how the creek froze in layers and which layer meant the ice was safe and which meant it was not. She learned things from him. There was more to the horse plan than she had accounted for, and he knew bloodlines and breeding in a way that was genuinely useful. And on the long evenings when the wind was up, he talked about it with a quiet excitement that she found herself looking forward to hearing. In November, there was a night when the temperature dropped to the point that the barn was not safe without the extra blankets from the cabin's second chest. And she brought them out to him through the snow, and he made coffee on the small brazier he had set up in the horse stall, and they sat on hay bales with the blankets and the coffee and the horses shifting quietly in their stalls. And she looked at him in the lantern light and thought that she had been building towards something for several weeks, and it was going to announce itself soon whether she was ready for it or not. "Tell me something true," she said, because it was a thing she had started saying to him on the trail back from Denver, and it had become the way they reached the things that mattered past the conversation that was easier. He looked at her in the lantern light. "I'm happier on this mountain, in this barn, in this cold than I have been anywhere in many years," he said. "That is the truest thing I know right now." She set down her coffee cup. "Warren," she said. "Yes," he said, and he was very still. She leaned forward and kissed him, which was not what she had planned to do, but which was entirely what the moment required, and he received it the way he received everything that mattered, with complete, undefended presence, one hand coming up to touch her face with a gentleness that was also honest, also entirely real. When they separated, she looked at him and he looked at her, and the horses were entirely unbothered, and the lantern gave off its steady, warm light. "I have been thinking about you since that first morning," he said quietly, "when you were standing in the yard with that rifle and the look on your face that said you had already won." "I had already won," she said. "Yes," he said, and his smile then was the most genuine thing she had ever seen on a human face. "You absolutely had." December on the mountain was a world of white and wind and early dark and long evenings, and the two of them moved through it with the developing ease of people who had decided something and were now finding out what the decision was actually made of. It was made of patience. They were both people who understood patience, and it was made of honesty, which was the thing between them from the beginning, and it was made of the particular steady warmth that comes from admiration that has been tested and verified. He kissed her at the door of the cabin one evening in early December when the snow was coming down in the way it did when it meant to accumulate, and she held onto the front of his canvas jacket and thought about how his particular presence on this mountain had gone from being a problem to solve to being the thing she came home to, and how that transition had happened not through any dramatic revolution, but through the daily, incremental evidence of who he was. Christmas on the mountain was the two of them and the Abelards, who came up on Christmas Day with their children and a ham and a bottle of good brandy, and received Warren Hadley with the thoughtful but ultimately warm acceptance of people who could see what was in front of them. Henry Abelard, who was a practical Frenchman from Quebec who had come west 20 years ago and built something real and recognized the same impulse in others, shook Warren's hand and looked at Pauline and nodded once in the way that meant, in his particular economy of expression, that he had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Genevieve Abelard, who was warmer and more verbal than her husband, pulled Pauline aside in the kitchen while the men were outside and said, "He looks at you the way Henry used to look at me before we got old and started taking each other for granted." And then, apparently deciding this was not quite what she meant, added, "But Henry still looks at me that way. I just do not notice it as much as I should. You should notice it." "I notice it," Pauline said. "Good," Genevieve said, and went back to the ham. January was the hard month, the month when the mountain reduced everything to its essential terms, and the essential terms were cold and dark, and the absolute necessity of another person. The cattle required twice daily attention through the deep cold snaps, and the horses Warren had brought in 2 mares in November, beginning the breeding operation with the quiet seriousness of someone making a long-term investment, required their own care. They fell into a routine of the work in the evenings, and the gradual, undramatic declaration that their living was becoming joint. On a January evening when the temperature outside was the kind of serious cold that made the cabin walls creak, Warren said, "I want to ask you something formal." She looked up from the sock she was mending, which was a domestic occupation she would not previously have admitted to in front of anyone. "I want to marry you, Pauline," he said. He was sitting across the table and he was entirely direct and entirely serious. "I want to marry you and I want to work this land with you and I want to put both our names on the deed and I want, if you want it too, to build something here that lasts longer than both of us." He paused. "I am aware that you have spent years building something that is entirely yours and I am not asking you to give that up. I am asking to add my name to it. As a partner. As your husband, if you will have me." Pauline set down the sock. She looked at him across the table in the firelight, this man who had arrived on her mountain with a fraudulent deed and clean boots and had spent the months since making himself someone she could not now imagine the mountain without. "The deed," she said, "stays in my name." "Yes," he said immediately. "But we can put your name on it too," she said, "as co-holder." "That is all I was asking," he said. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and the fire made its sound and the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and outside the mountain was cold and white and entirely theirs. They were married in the spring, in April when the mountain was coming back to life in the particular way it did after a long winter, the snow pulling back to show the first green of the grass, and the aspens budding out along the creek in that specific acid-bright green that was the most alive color Pauline had ever known. The ceremony was held at the Abelard place because it was larger and more accessible than the cabin, with a minister from Golden City who made the 2-day ride up for the occasion and seemed genuinely moved by the setting. The mountains white on the upper peaks and green-brown below, and the sky the high-altitude blue that meant nothing between you and the heavens. Robert Finch came from Denver, which Pauline had not expected but Warren had arranged, and she was quietly glad for it because Finch had been present from the beginning of this particular story, and it felt right that he should be present for this part of it. He brought word that Elias Cormack had been convicted on 3 counts of land fraud and sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, and that the civil suit had recovered a portion of Warren's $1,500, not all of it but enough. Warren wore his best clothes, which were the good ones she had seen him arrive in, the coat cleaned and pressed, and he had managed to acquire new boots that had already begun to earn their honest mud, and he looked at her when she came up the aisle between the rows of chairs that Genevieve had set up in the Abelard's main room, and the look on his face was the one she had seen in the lantern light in December. The same undefended realness that had been undoing her careful defenses since the morning she had almost smiled at him over the fire. She wore her mother's dress, which she had kept in the trunk at the foot of her bed for the 7 years since she had brought it from Pueblo, never quite being able to leave it behind and never quite knowing why. It was ivory silk that had gone ivory with age from its original white, and it fit her as though it had been made for her, which it had. Her mother had been her precise height and her precise shape, and wearing it was a complicated grief and joy simultaneously. She thought her father would have liked Warren Hadley, and the thought was a warmth in her chest through the whole ceremony. They went back to the mountain as husband and wife on a spring evening, with the creek running loud and clear with snowmelt, and the cattle content in the lower pasture, and the 2 mares large with their first foals, and everything about the future open and possible in the way that only comes once or twice in a life. Warren stood on the porch that first evening back and looked out at the meadow and the timber and the peaks, and she stood beside him with his arm around her shoulders, and the mountain doing what the mountain always did, which was to make everything that was not essential into background noise. "This is what I came for," he said quietly. "You came for a property you had never seen," she reminded him. "I came for something real," he corrected gently. "I just did not know yet what shape it would take." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood there until the stars came out. The summer of 1883 was a good one by mountain standards, long and warm enough in the high meadows, and well watered from the spring snowmelt that the hay crop came in heavy, and the pasture was lush and green well into August. The two mares Warren had brought in the previous November had foaled in April two handsome colts, both sound and well-proportioned, carrying the bloodlines Warren had selected with care. And the work of the horse operation had a particular pleasure to it that was different from cattle, a more attentive and individual quality that suited both of them. Warren had written to contacts in Denver and Fort Collins about the colts, and there was already interest from two ranchers who wanted quality working horses, and had heard through the network that had existed in the Colorado horse world since before the railroad that there was a serious breeding operation developing in the Jefferson County high country. The first colt sold in July for a price that more than covered the season's operating costs and left a surplus for reinvestment, and they celebrated with a supper that Pauline cooked with particular care, and a bottle of wine that Warren had brought from Denver and been saving for the right moment. They were also, by that summer, expecting their first child. Pauline had suspected in May and been certain by June, and she had told Warren on an evening when the light was long and warm and they were sitting on the porch after supper, and the mountain was particularly itself. She told him simply, directly, the way she did everything, and watched his face go through something she had no precise word for, a wonder that was larger than happiness, that was quieter and more serious than joy. A man confronted with the fact that the life he had been hoping for was actually, genuinely happening. He put both his hands over hers on the porch rail and they stood there and the mountain went gold around them. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was Warren happiness and concern arriving together, never one without the other. "I am very well," she said. "Women have been doing this on harder ground than mine." "That does not mean I am going to be anything other than thoroughly attentive," he said. "I expected nothing less," she said, and she was not annoyed by the prospect, which was itself a revelation about what the past year had done to certain of her long-held positions. He did not hover, because she would not have tolerated hovering, but he was present in the ways that mattered, taking the heavier fence work without discussion, making sure there was always good food ready, riding down to the Abelards regularly to maintain the connection with Genevieve, who had raised 3 children on a mountain ranch, and whose practical knowledge was of the sort that no doctor in a distant city could fully replace. Genevieve Abelard came up to stay for the last 2 weeks of October and the first week of November, which was when Pauline's time was due, and she brought with her the calm competence of a woman who knew what this was and how to manage it, and was not going to make it larger or smaller than it needed to be. Warren was in the barn for the hardest hours, which was where Genevieve sent him because she knew men and knew which ones could be present without being in the way and which ones could not. And Warren, for all his many genuine qualities, could not quite manage that particular discipline when it came to Pauline, and Genevieve made an executive decision. The child arrived on the 2nd of November, 1883, in a cabin on a mountain in Jefferson County, Colorado, with snow coming down outside, and a fire going inside, and Genevieve Abelard saying practical, reassuring things in a blend of English and French, and Pauline Norris Hadley, who had managed 4 years alone on a 7,000-foot mountain, and faced down a property dispute with a rifle, and never once cried in front of anyone she could remember. Allowed herself to be held for a moment after it was done, just a moment, before she collected herself and asked about the baby. "A boy," Genevieve said, with the satisfaction of someone reporting very good news. "Healthy and loud, which is what you want." She brought Warren in from the barn, and he came through the cabin door with snow on his shoulders and his face pale from cold and worry, and he stopped at the edge of the room and looked at Pauline in the bed with the baby in her arms, and his face did the thing she loved most about him. It went entirely transparent, every feeling visible, the relief and the wonder and the love all there without armor or calculation. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression of a man confronting something so much larger than anything he had expected that ordinary language had simply excused itself. "Thomas," Pauline said. "I want to name him Thomas." Warren looked at her. "For your father." "Yes," she said. "Thomas Hadley," he said quietly, trying the sound of it, and it was right in the way only true things were right. "Thomas Hadley," she agreed. He put his arm carefully around her, and she leaned against him, and the baby was warm, and the fire was going, and outside the mountain was doing what mountains did in November, putting down its first serious snow, and settling in for the long winter with the permanence of something that had been here long before them and would be here long after, and the three of them were exactly where they were supposed to be. The winters that followed had their hardships, because every winter at that altitude did, but they had also a quality of richness that Pauline had not expected, the richness of a shared life that was genuinely shared, not the performance of sharing but the actual thing. Warren was, as she had known from early on, a man who did not do things by halves, and the life he put himself into on that mountain was as complete and committed a life as she had seen anyone live. He learned everything the mountain required of him, and he learned it properly, without shortcuts, and by the second year he was as capable a high-country ranch hand as any hired man she might have found, and by the third year he was better than most. The horse operation grew in the quiet, incremental way that good things grew, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily and with quality at its center. By 1885, they had a string of 12 horses in various stages of development, and a reputation in the territory for breeding animals that were sound in wind and limb, and disposition to work, which was the combination that actually mattered to people who used horses for real purposes. Warren's contacts from his business days proved useful in unexpected ways. He knew how to write a clear letter and how to negotiate a fair price, and how to keep records that meant something. And Pauline had the land knowledge and the animal sense, and together the combination was better than either alone would have been. Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler who climbed everything and feared nothing, which his mother found both familiar and exhausting, and a toddler into a small child who followed his father to the horse barn with the absolute conviction that horses were the most important things in the world, and who followed his mother to the pasture and the fence lines with the equally absolute conviction that the land was most important. He was going to be unable to choose between the two, which Pauline thought was probably the best possible outcome. In the spring of 1886, a second child arrived, another boy they named James after Warren's grandfather in Ohio, and James was quieter than Thomas and more watchful, with his father's particular quality of stillness and his mother's dark eyes. 2 boys on a mountain ranch was about the right number for the work they had in front of them, though Pauline maintained, and Warren agreed, that the boys were going to be educated properly and given choices about what they did with their lives that were not limited to the mountain. Because the thing Thomas Norris had given his daughter was the understanding that a child needed to know their own mind, and that required knowing what the options were. The school in the nearest valley town was 4 miles down the trail, which was manageable on horseback in good weather and required boarding in town during the worst winter months, and Pauline made arrangements with a respectable family there for when the boys were old enough, and the arrangements were made the way she made everything directly, fairly, with every important detail in writing. Robert Finch came to visit in the summer of 1886, bringing his wife Margaret, who was a brisk and intelligent woman who looked at the mountain operation with the appreciation of someone who understood what had been built here. They stayed for a week, and Finch and Warren spent long evenings talking, and on one of those evenings Pauline sat with Margaret on the porch while the men were inside and the mountains went purple and orange at sunset, and Margaret said, "He is entirely different from what I expected, based on what Robert told me about the man he knew in St. Louis." "What did you expect?" Pauline asked. "Someone accomplished and pleasant and essentially at a slight distance from everything," Margaret said. "The kind of man who is in a room but not entirely present in it." She looked out at the mountains. "He is entirely present here. Yes, Pauline said, he is. That is what you did, Margaret said simply. Pauline considered arguing and then did not, because Margaret was not wrong. They had done it to each other, she thought, the presence, the rootedness, the particular quality of being thoroughly in a life rather than watching it from nearby. It was what the mountain required, and what they had learned from each other how to do. The years laid themselves down the way good years did on a working ranch, each one distinct in its weather and its challenges, and its moments of plainly visible grace. There was a year when the snowpack was too thin, and the summer too dry, and the grass came in sparse and they sold off half the horse string rather than run short through the winter. And there was a year when lightning took down the corner of the hay barn, and they rebuilt it in a week with the Abelard's help, and the help of 2 other neighboring families who came without being asked, because that was the economy of the high country, labor freely given knowing it would be freely returned. There was a year when Thomas, who was 12 by then, broke his collarbone falling from the roof of the horse barn, where he had been doing exactly what his mother had told him not to do, and Warren sat with him through the painful setting, and the recovery with a patience that Pauline had to admit she might not have managed herself. And Thomas recovered with the speed of youth and the minimum of drama, and immediately went back to climbing things, which was simply who he was. There was a beautiful fall in 1888 when Pauline walked the fence line with Warren on a clear October afternoon, the aspens at their absolute best gold, the sky that high-altitude blue, the peaks already white above the tree line, and she stopped at the corner post, the one her father had set, the one she always stopped at, and stood there looking at all of it. Warren stopped beside her and looked with her and did not say anything, because he had learned that this was a place she came to be with her father and the silence was part of it. After a while she said, "He would have liked what we have done with it." "Yes," Warren said, "I believe he would have." "He would have had opinions about the horse fencing," she said. "He would have been right," Warren said, and she laughed, which was a sound that the mountain received with its usual equanimity, and that Warren Hadley, even after 6 years of hearing it, found to be one of the finest sounds in the world. They stood there in the afternoon light at the corner post on the mountain that had been Thomas Norris's dream, and had become his daughter's home, and had become, through the particular accident of a fraudulent sale, and a man who had bought sight unseen, and found something infinitely more real than he had bargained for, the foundation of a life that held 2 people and 2 children, and a horse operation of genuine reputation, and a cabin that had been expanded twice to accommodate the growing reality of it all. Pauline Norris Hadley, who had been 26 years old and alone, and holding a rifle when a stranger rode into her clearing, was 32 now and no longer alone, and kept the rifle in its place by the door out of long habit and the enduring good sense that the mountain had always required. And she stood at her father's fence post with her husband's shoulder warm beside hers, and felt the particular, specific weight of a life that had been built honestly, by hand, on ground that was truly hers. "What are you thinking?" Warren asked, which was a question he had earned the right to ask. "That my father looked at a map," she said, "and saw something worth climbing to." She looked up at the white peaks above them. "He was right," she said. "He was entirely right." Warren put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the aspens turned their gold leaves in the clean mountain wind, and the cattle moved in the lower pasture, and in the barn the horses shifted and breathed, and on the porch of the cabin 4 miles up the mountain James, who was 2, was having an argument with Thomas, who was 5, about something that would matter enormously until it did not. And the mountain stood around all of it as it had stood for 10,000 years before, and would stand for 10,000 after, patient and vast and entirely indifferent to the small, essential, irreplaceable business of human happiness that was taking place upon it. They walked back up the trail as the sun went lower and the air went colder, and the cabin windows were already bright with lamplight against the early dark, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up in the still air, and coming up the last turn of the path and seeing it, the cabin and the light and the small dark shapes of children on the porch, Pauline Norris felt the thing that her father had always told her was the truest measure of any piece of ground, that when you approached it, you were approaching home. She had first felt it as a young girl coming up the mountain from Pueblo in the spring of 1878. She felt it now with a fullness that the years had deepened rather than diminished, coming up the path in the October dusk with her husband beside her and her sons, calling out from the porch in her father's land rich and cared for around her, and the whole accumulated weight of what it meant to fight for something real, and win it honestly pressing on her heart with the comfortable, essential heaviness of a life genuinely lived. Thomas came running down the path to meet them in the way he always did, arms wide, entirely confident that they would receive whatever he arrived with: energy, news, the remnants of some small argument, the overflow of a 5-year-old's very large experience of being alive, and Warren caught him mid-stride and swung him up and kept walking. And Pauline reached out and ruffled her eldest son's hair, and he complained about it with theatrical indignation, and the three of them came up the path together into the lamplight, and behind them the mountain settled into its evening dark, and the stars began their absolute, patient business overhead. Inside, Genevieve Abelard, who was here for the week, as she often was, because the friendship between the two women had deepened over the years into something as solid and necessary as the cabin walls themselves, had supper on the stove and James on her hip, and a look on her face that said everything had been fine, and she was glad they were back and the food was ready. And it was ready, and they were back, and the mountain was cold outside and warm inside, and Pauline Norris Hadley sat down at the table in her father's cabin on her father's land on the mountain he had seen in a map and known was worth climbing to, and her husband sat across from her and her sons were loud and good between them, and the fire went and the supper went, and the evening went in the way of all good evenings, which is to say entirely too quickly and in the memory permanently. Later, after the boys were in their beds and Genevieve had retired to the room they kept for guests, and the cabin was quiet, Pauline and Warren sat at the cleared table with tea and the low fire, and the particular silence of two people who had learned each other thoroughly enough that silence between them was not empty, but was full of the easy companionship of the genuinely known. 7 years, he said, because it was the October anniversary of his arrival on the mountain, and he had tracked it from the first year because it was the date his life had actually started. 7 years, she agreed. You were standing in the yard with a rifle, he said. You were wearing very clean boots, she said. He smiled and she smiled, and outside the wind came over the Continental Divide and went past the cabin and moved on. And the mountain was where it had always been and always would be, and everything that mattered in the world was in this room, and had been earned by hand and by honesty and by the willingness to trust, carefully and finally, completely. She reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers in the way that was by now entirely familiar and still, every single time, something she had not taken for granted. Go to sleep, she said. In a minute, he said. They stayed a minute longer, and the fire burned down a little more, and then they went to bed in the cabin on the mountain that had always been exactly where it was supposed to be, waiting for the people who were brave enough to claim it.